So today I'm going to talk about the sharing economy, and I was going to do a little more of the work of sort of situating the sharing economy within the larger economy, responding to the question that Helena and the organizers of the colloquium have put to all the speakers, which is about social change and transformation, both how do we see social change happening, and then obviously in this case sort of what role do I see for the sharing economy in making social change and developing a sustainable, socially and ecologically sustainable economy. And then the sort of more sociological stuff on paradoxes of openness and distinction. I was thinking probably I wouldn't do as much because there's the paper, but we can talk about them. So I thought I'd just mention a little bit about one of the 4 cases in there. And that also leads me to just let everyone know that this is Will Atwood Charles, who is one of the co-authors of the paper. He's a PhD student and at Boston College with me. He's part of the research team, and he is doing the makerspace case. So lots of interesting work that he's doing, and I'm sure he'd be happy to also talk about that. So here's the outline for the paper. I just want to go through what I was thinking of as sort of hot button topics about the sharing economy to just get the point out in case the sharing economy has raised a lot of strong feelings in some people, and so I thought I'd just lay some of my cards out on the table. And then I want to talk about the sort of what I see as new and important about the sharing economy, tell you a little bit about the research project, the connection between the quote-unquote sharing economy and the larger peer production movement, and then the distinction piece, and then sort of back around to social change. So first point, I don't think we need to spend a lot of time talking about this. It's not really sharing. It's a misnomer for many of the platforms in the space, Airbnb being an obvious one. This is a bulletin board, or an ad I found in New York City where Airbnb is doing a lot of advertising to convince New Yorkers that it's a good thing, and here you have big backlash against it, and of course the shared economy is a lie. So the question of whether the word sharing applies to renting out a bedroom, or maybe your whole house, or maybe the 6-unit building that you purchased specifically for the purpose of renting out. And we can talk about if there are any dimensions of Airbnb which are sharing. I think some people might argue that there are. But there's a lot more to the sharing economy than Airbnb and Uber. And there are real sharing initiatives going on, some of which we're going to talk about. But second, do not tag me with Uber. Do no evil. Of course, Google is a big investor in Uber. Google's model was do no evil. Does Uber follow that motto? I think most of us would probably say no. And my friend, probably many of you around the table also know her, Robin Chase, the founder of Zipcar, who lives here in Cambridge, is writing a book on the sharing economy, and she's got a great line in there in which she asks, is the platform your partner or your pimp? And she says, Uber is definitely your pimp. So, an interesting thing about Uber, though, is Uber claims no connection to the sharing economy. They don't advertise themselves as a sharing platform. They don't participate in the organizations that are sort of umbrella organizations of the sharing economy and so forth. So, Uber is a bad actor. What is the sharing economy? I've sometimes written about it as a tent that, a lot of people want to get under this tent. And because who would not want to be associated with sharing? Everybody loves sharing. It's a a wholesome halo wholesome halo concept or term. But I would say that the tent is too big to be coherent, and when you sit down and try and actually define what the sharing economy is, if you're looking at actors who define themselves as part of it, who participate in it, or who the press defines as part of the sharing economy, it is so variable that it's really hard to be able to talk about it in analytically coherent ways, because what's under that tent is so diverse. So I'll give you a definition of what I think it is, but I just wanted to lay that out there. When I asked some people who are very active in sort of some of the meta-organizations of the sharing economy how it's defined, they said it's defined into, there's no rhyme or reason to it, because there are platforms which are nearly identical, and one is considered in and the other is considered out. I mean, Lyft and Uber would be an example of that, but TaskRabbit and Mechanical Turk, Amazon's labor platform, nobody would ever think of Amazon as part of the sharing economy, but they're doing the same, basically the same thing that these other platforms, which are very much consider themselves part of it. So so they say it's what the organizations who want in and what the press says. So clearly completely incoherent. There's another issue which is about the ecological impacts of the sharing economy. And if you look at a lot of the discourse around the sharing economy, particularly earlier, I'd say there's a little bit less now, a lot of talk about how it is carbon and eco-footprint reducing. And if you talk to users, both on the provider side and on the consumer side of the sharing economy, they are also highly invested in this idea that what they are doing is footprint reducing. It is, whether or not they actually are footprint reducing is a much more complicated question, and I think there's a lot of reason to think that with some of these platforms the answer is no. A prime example of that is Zipcar. And here are just some of the things that Zipcar is advertising that it does. It gives you a car at any time, spontaneous, spur-of-the-moment car. It puts cars in universities for college students who previously had no access to cars. It gives you fancier cars. You can drive a snazzy German Audi. It's cheaper to drive. And right there, when you hear that it's cheaper to drive, that gives you a clue to the fact that it may, it's likely not to be footprint reducing, because it is giving people a much wider group of people access to cars than previously had them. Now this is obviously a much more complicated question. There is a little bit of research on this. There are sharing economy platforms that are footprint reducing, but in part because of that big tent, and in part because a big part of what the sharing economy is doing is making access to goods and services cheaper for people. It is unlikely to be footprint reducing, sort of prima facie. So we can come back to that. One last, I think this is my last hot button issue, and this is about a topic in the sharing economy that's gotten a lot of attention, and that is so-called gig labor or indie labor, these people who are earning money providing services on the sharing economy versus the people who are renting out their assets. And it turns out the dynamics of those things are quite different. If you have an expensive apartment to rent on Airbnb, your situation is a lot different than someone who's trying to be a rabbit, no longer called rabbits, now they're called taskers, on a platform like TaskRabbit, which is basically an errand service or a low-end concierge service where people pay money for these rabbits to do things like, okay, probably the most common one is put your IKEA furniture together. there are people who are able to use these platforms in a way that's actually pretty reasonable in terms of remuneration, at least hourly remuneration, but they tend to be people who have a fairly highly valued skill. So we, for example, have people in our sample who are translators, and they get access to translating jobs on the platform. This person actually started a little subcontracting business where he's subcontracting translation out to others. So it's been kind of lucrative for him. If you have if you're really good at something that is not in very excess supply, you can do all right. But what seems to be happening on these kinds of platforms, in addition to in the transportation space, where the number of providers has increased a lot, is that you have excess supply on the provider side. So the remuneration seems to be going down, and the conditions of work seem to be degraded. And one of the things that critics have talked a lot about is race to the bottom, which, as you can think about in a platform, this one in particular no longer is, but it started out as an auction site. So someone would post a task, and the rabbits who wanted to do it would bid for it. So you have a very rapid movement of the remuneration down to some floor. Well, what is the floor? I mean, we're in the $10 an hour economy, but we have people complaining at this point even that they're unable to get even $10 an hour because travel time isn't included and not, setup time is not included and so forth. And of course, there's a lot that's been written about the fact that the platforms are adamant that these are not employees, and therefore they have none of the protections of employees, the labor laws don't apply, and so forth. So the situation there is getting, I think, pretty ugly. Okay, so there's some others, but I'll just leave that aside and get on to sort of how do I understand the sharing economy? So there are a number of different major categories for what's going on. On the one hand, and here you have the original platforms, what I would define as the sort of real beginnings of the at least platform, digital sharing, and that is the recirculation of used goods. So you have a lot of that happening. It starts with Craigslist and eBay, but there are plenty of other sharing economy sites. You have things like Freecycle and Yerdle, which are gift exchange. You have swap sites, you have barter sites, you have selling sites, you have renting sites, so lots of different sites for the recirculation of used goods. And I've written about the idea that these were propelled in large part because of the big consumer binge of the 1990s and 2000s before the crash. So you have these rising inventories of used goods that have pretty low value for consumers, and so it's not surprising that you would get a big surge in secondhand markets. And the digital technology made it much more convenient to do that than doing it just through the old style yard sales and so forth. Second major category is loaning or renting durable assets. And in the lingo of the space, this is sort of using idle, they talk about the use of idle capacity. And an interesting thing about our interviews is we find a lot of people using that language, the language of efficiency, the idea that it's inefficient to have a car sitting in the driveway 24 hours a day if you only use it 1 hour a day, and shouldn't other people be using it, the excess space in your home, or the fact that you have a yard and you're not using it for gardening, but there are people who want to garden and don't have access, or you have an expensive camera that you rarely use, and wouldn't it be nice if your neighbors could take advantage of that, camping equipment, so on and so forth. So valuable, durable assets that are used partially, and there's both a loaning and a non-monetized part of this segment, and of course the monetized segment, things like Airbnb or relay rides, which is a car rental. The sharing of non-durable assets, and we've been studying a lot of those, things like food swaps and meal sharing and so forth. So that's a much smaller space, but that's also happening. And one of our cases is a food swap. Service exchanges like TaskRabbit, which I've been talking about, but also the nonprofits like a time bank, which we're also studying. And then, of course, there's crowdsourced finance, which we're not studying at all, but that's a very large segment. And there's a lot happening in crowdsourced finance and different kinds. And there are other things that are going on, but those are the major ones. Now, as I said, it's hard to define it. Boundary conditions are hard to define, lots of debates about definitions. I would say there are two things which to me define sharing economy. Now, it doesn't mean that if you have these two things you're in sharing economy, but they're necessary, although not sufficient conditions. One is peer-to-peer, and that means that it is individuals to individuals, so that the trades are being made not from company to consumer or company to company, but what are called peers. So that's the difference between relay rides and Zipcar. Zipcar is a company that owns the cars. I mean, it's now Avis, but it always owned the cars, and it was just renting to consumers for shorter intervals of time than ordinary car companies. It had a lot of feel-good rhetoric around it, it had a lot of good intention behind it, but it really wasn't sharing. I mean, it was sharing in the sense that more people were using the car within a 24-hour period than in a typical rental. But if you use that terminology for sharing, then there are so many restaurants are almost everything is sharing. Yeah, everything is sharing. So peer-to-peer, whereas relay rides is a true peer-to-peer market in which you have a platform that puts the peers together. So you have people who have cars that they rent out to other people. But it's just ordinary people in their cars who are renting to other ordinary people in their cars. By ordinary, I mean non-business. So peer-to-peer and second, digitally enabled. Now, pretty much everything has a website these days. We'll see that some of our cases, the digital dimension is not huge. But I think that for many of the platforms, obviously if it's a platform, it's digital. For many of these initiatives, the digital dimension is really important, and you'll see why. So, this is just another one of these obvious points. Of course, sharing has been going on long before the internet. The discourse of novelty around the quote-unquote sharing economy has been a little bit offensive to people of color, working class people, etc., who never stopped sharing. And we hear that from people when we talk about the sharing economy as if it is something new. So we try to be careful. I like to talk about the new sharing economy to differentiate it from old forms of sharing, because there are important dimensions of this. I think what's happened, and I don't have data on this yet, but there's a line of research in sociology that it's not, it doesn't have the historical reach, but I think as we go forward we'll be able to see a little bit more of a time period there. My colleague Natasha Sarkeesian works on this, which is that practices of reciprocity outside of sort of standard market relations, so that is transfers of goods, money, and time/services have remained higher in poorer communities. And so as income goes up, people purchase more services and have less economies of reciprocity or sharing economies. And this is an example of a tool lending library, which actually these are more popular in poor African American communities where people do a lot of home renovation and so forth because they can't afford to have contracted for that, and tools are expensive. And so there has been, long before the current sharing economy, these tool libraries, they are witnessing a renaissance now, so there's a lot of deliberate attempt to create more tool libraries. But what's really different about the contemporary sharing economy is that it is sharing among strangers, because historically, although there are some exceptions, and we can all think about the Odyssey and the sort of role of hospitality to strangers in Greek culture, and so, we all learned about that, but in terms of a widespread practice, sharing happened mostly traditionally through social networks. So you might host a stranger in your home, but it would be someone vouched for within your social network. It wouldn't be someone who you have no social connection to. And that's what's different, because now what's happening is that people are involved in exchanges, often quite intimate exchanges, and we could say quite risky exchanges with people that they have no connection to whatsoever. And you could say that's really paradoxical in today's world, in which you have a lot more fearfulness of strangers, in which you have high levels of crime and malfeasance in certain ways and so forth. And this is where the digital dimension becomes so important, because it is the use of crowd-sourced information on people which has made it, I don't want to say possible, but which has facilitated the willingness of people to engage in these stranger exchanges. So that's really, really important, and for that the digital is crucial. The other important thing that the digital does is that it dramatically reduces the transactions cost of making exchanges. And if you think about a lot of these markets, like the second-hand market or the small-scale rental market, etc., there's a lot of setup time to make exchanges. And one of the reasons people didn't do it as much is because, for one thing, the goods are cheaper in these markets, and so the return is smaller relative to transactions cost. So I can think about all those used clothes piling up in my closet, and then thinking about trying to sell them, and all the time it would take, and forget it, you're just giving them to Goodwill or whatever, you're letting them stay there. When you have you have platforms like ThreadUp, for example, which is the Netflix of used clothing. They send, for those of us old enough to remember when Netflix actually had physical discs, they send you an envelope, you throw the clothes in the envelope and you ship them out, and that's it. It's very no muss, no fuss. And that's for items with physical presence. And when you're talking about transactions where you're not even dealing with material goods as much, these transactions have been made really, really seamless. Of course, that's one of the things that people talk about why they like Uber so much. I don't have to take out my credit card. I don't have to do this. But on relay rides, you book the car, there's keyless entry. I mean, everything has been made very, very low cost in terms of the transactions time involved relative to what these markets used to be. So there is real sharing going on. Couch surfing, which was free, basically free Airbnb, which I found out recently. One of the big reasons couch surf, that's where people host other people in their couches or rooms. It turned out actually a lot of what people liked about couch surfing was meeting people of the opposite sex. So it turned out it was kind of like a dating thing, which I never knew before, but I've learned recently. So that's a non-monetized, of course, Freecycle, and I don't think I have Yurtle here, but Yurtle's another gift site. So these are Freecycle organized people into communities with reciprocal giving. So if you joined a Freecycle community, you're not just supposed to give, you're also supposed to take. So it was really trying to build social connection and reduce footprint and so forth. Things like co-working and where people are sharing office spaces. There are for-profit versions of this which aren't so shary, but there are also shary versions, and of course Kickstarter. And Etsy, which is a platform for selling things, but it's also kind of interesting. So, and then the projects that are in the paper I shared with you. So, so those are just some sort of preliminaries about the sharing economy. Let me tell you a little bit about the research that we've been doing. I've referred to it already a few times. It's funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and we've been looking at various wasn't called the sharing economy then. We called it the connected consumption. That was our term for it originally, both thinking about social connection, digital connection. Now we call it connected economy. We're interested in the possibilities of these innovations for creating a different kind of sustainable economy. I personally got interested in them as a result of the last book, non-edited volume I published, the Plenitude book, in which I was thinking about ways that people could de-link from the formal employment system, work fewer hours, get access to goods and services more cheaply and in different ways. And so this, obviously this is something that was starting to come up at that time. A lot of the bigger platforms started around 2009. It's a very post-recession phenomenon. So we have to date 7 cases that we have done. Almost all of the data collection is finished with the 7. We'll probably be adding a couple more. Be interested in, if people have suggestions for cases we should do. We have a number that we're thinking about. We're also thinking about doing some quantitative analysis if one of the platforms will give us their data, and we've been in communication with some of them. So we did a time bank, a food swap, a makerspace. As I said, that's Will's. We did what we call an open education space, so that's people who are getting free online educational resources. So all these resources that are out there for people to share or use, whether it's the MOOCs or Khan Academy or something like Skillshare, which is an actual offline platform. It has an online dimension, but also has offline. There are a lot of these new initiatives that have sprung up to give people access to skills outside of formal educational institutions, and a lot of them are free or very low cost. And a lot's happening on the sort of coding side, business development and so forth. And this open education case, it's interesting, partly because many of our informants were here, not all of them, sort of morphed into a case about startup culture, because so many of the people we found using online and open educational resources were trying to be entrepreneurs. Airbnb is one of our cases, Relay Rides is one of our cases, and TaskRabbit is one of our cases. So those are the 7. In the cases, we have common methodology for the most part. We do interviews with participants, and so we typically have somewhere 30 to 40 interviews, sort of long, in-depth interviews. We do participant observation. So Will, for example, has spent untold number of hours at the makerspace, often very extensive, so hundreds and hundreds of hours of participant observation. In cases where it's relevant, we analyze the exchange data among participants. We do what's called the discourse analysis of the way people are talking about the space, the way the space is talking about itself, and then we also do interviews with people who founded the space or the staff and so on and so forth. There are multiple motives for participating in the sharing economy. Economic, it's good value for money, these things. So this is a really important dimension of this. An Airbnb place is much cheaper than a hotel, etc. And also we find a lot of people in the platforms where there's earning opportunity, we find a lot of young people with student debt. So they are interested in reducing that debt, and we also have people sort of lower the remuneration, like the TaskRabbit. We have the people who are sort of in the worst economic circumstances in terms of having graduated from college and not having a proper job. So they're doing this sort of thing. I should also mention our sample is always confined to people 18 to 34, because these are the innovators and early adopters and core of the sharing economy at the beginning, and also because of the nature of the grant, it's a project that is more oriented to young people. We decided to do that. I mentioned earlier ecological consciousness. There's also a cultural critique, people who are critical of excessive marketization, excessive commodification. Of course, that's less in the more commodified platforms. A very frequently expressed desire for more social connection, and you see that across the space, even if you're talking to someone who took Lyft or Uber. Like, it's a real person, I'm talking to them. And then we also find technophilia, people who love doing it because of the sophisticated technological interfaces, as well as the novelty of it, which draws a lot of people. So these are 2 slides of our papers, and I think the presentation will be on the website. So for people who want to see the papers, we've got a lot of papers at this point. So something that wasn't in the papers, but that really ties to the question of social change that I want to emphasize is that many of these platforms are very similar to more classical forms of what is called peer production. For those of you who have read about peer production, you know about the production of things like Linux, which is an open source operating system that was produced through what is either called a peer production or a collaborative production method by programmers who are not being paid, who are in a so-called peer situation. That is, they all come, it's an open access process, which means anyone can join it. Very important. And these are other peer-produced products, Wikipedia, Firefox, Thunderbird, etc., etc. This is an extremely important movement. It has happened in culture, it has happened in information, it has happened in software, citizen science, citizen knowledge, etc., etc. And it is an emergent form of production that's really important for a number of reasons, and I think I have. And it's also, so what we see in the sharing economy is the emergence also of peer-produced kinds of products. Now, let me talk about why peer production is so important. So the first point I made a minute ago, open access and formal equality of participants. So this is an economy, these are economies structured on very different terms than sort of the capitalist economy, in which there isn't formal equality. Now, you can gain reputation in a peer production system, and people will listen to you more or less, depending on how good, if you're in a coding community, how good your coding is, or so forth. But it's an open access situation. Everyone can join, everyone can participate. And they tend to be democratically governed. They are efficient in lots of ways. They tap people's non-monetary motives. They use small slices of time that are otherwise not productive for people. So there are a variety of ways in which they're efficient. And there's another really important efficiency about them. Because they are not owned privately, and they are the products of peer production are typically open source or free, and there's a whole big distinction between those. I'm not going to get into it now, but they are made freely available. They follow the rules of efficient pricing for these kinds of products, i.e. zero pricing, because their marginal cost is zero. It is inefficient to restrict information. That's like, we got economists here in the room. That's like a very basic economic finding. And so what the emergence of this kind of production means is that we are getting efficient distribution of these things, i.e. free distribution. Now we have to worry about the problem of how do you produce, and the old story is, well, you have to price them to get people to make them. And what we see with the rise of the peer production movement is that that's not true. People don't have to be paid to make these things. We've got an incredible amount of stuff being produced in this economy, not for money. So that insight, I think, is really important for if we're thinking about social change and moving to a different kind of economy. How much peer production can we organize? and the more the better, and how much can we do in the consumption space. So I see it as an emergent alternative to for-profit production, and of course, it's a commons. A peer production system is a commons, and we know that ecological commons, like information commons, need to be managed according to processes other than centralized authority, the state, or private property, Ostrom, et cetera, et cetera. So this might be a necessary, but it's not sufficient to ensure egalitarian outcomes, but I think it's important. So, and here we get to the social change part of it. With these platforms, I think the platforms have tremendous potential to create real sharing enterprises because of the things that I talked about, what you get from the digital technology, what you get from a peer production process. If they are owned by a small, if they're privately owned and managed to extract profit, you won't get it. You'll get Uber the pimp. And you can see, the tendency when you have the big money in there to move them in that direction. But let's just think about an example of how great it could be. I'll take the example of home healthcare aides, and then I'm just about done. Right now, home healthcare aides they're going through agencies who take a huge fraction of their pay. Jonathan may remember, I put the number in the piece that's coming out. I don't know if it's 50% or half. I mean, it's an extraordinary amount. And these people get a small fraction of the value that consumers are willing to pay for their services. Why? The consumers are really worried about getting trustworthy people, and the agencies are the brokers who do the trustworthiness. Now, that's what all that crowdsourced information is about. If we had a really good process, we're not there yet. There's a whole literature on the inaccuracies of the ratings, but we're going to get there. There's a lot being done to improve this. Once we get accurate ratings and reputational systems through crowdsourced information, why can't the home health care aides set up their own platform and take all their money? That is the potential that's here. And Airbnb they haven't been like Uber in the sense that they take a fairly small fraction compared to what the sites of the past took. The sites of the past took half, I think. The vacation, home away, and those sorts of things. They took a really large fraction. But the thing is, if you have open entry in these spaces, and you can replicate this software not too expensively, then actually the potential for people getting together to sort of cooperatively own platforms and govern those platforms and truly do what the sharing economy said it was about at the beginning, which was moving the value to the consumer and the producer. I think there's tremendous potential here. So that's the sort of vision. There are also sociological issues, distinction, reproduction of inequality, all the stuff that's in that paper, which I'm now going to just go through, as I thought I wouldn't have time for. I have one last slide, which is about my theory of social change. So there's the point of all the slides that I just went through in the paper was to say it's not just economic. There also are ways in which inequality reproduces itself even in these formally open spaces, and that's what the paper is about. But I mentioned the plenitude model and what I was thinking about there, reducing dependence on formal sector employment, reduce costs of living through self-provisioning, consumer innovations. I would also add something I wish I'd put in that book more, municipal provision of basic services. But the peer-to-peer model can be the basis for a new economic system. It's not for absolutely everything, but for a lot of what needs to be produced and consumed. The platforms are efficient, they can scale really rapidly. If you think about how hard it's been to create cooperatives in the non-digital space, I mean, we only have fewer than 10,000 or about 10,000 cooperatives in this country, worker cooperatives. Absolutely painful to set these things up. And yet, these platforms scale so quickly. We could, I think, develop cooperatively controlled and governed platforms that could actually scale. I believe that to get a new economic and social sustainable world, we need to construct economic alternatives in the here and now, both for demonstration effects, but also because they become the seeds of what becomes the new system, and we have to work them out. So I focus a lot on economic alternatives. I think that creating vested economic interests can be really important for creating a foundation for social movements. The alternative kinds of practices that people are involved in, whether it's, organic and local agriculture that then becomes, pushes the USDA or whatever, that the vested interests of the new system will be important in creating a social movement. Of course, social movements are necessary of the old style. Engaging the state remains vital. But I think there's a lot to be done in this non-state space of economic innovation. Thank you.